Welcome to the Matt Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast about nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. Okay, welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 20. You can say hallelujah and amen if you want to. I would not be at all offended by that. I'm not going to because, well, I think it would just sound stupid. But I did want to talk about a few things today. One is kind of what's going on in my world. I am getting ready to actually finally get out in the field. This has been just a blazing hot summer here in the United States, particularly in the south, but even in the north it's been extremely hot. Really kind of coming to the end of the dog days here in North Carolina. And generally, North Carolinians don't really do much this time of year. They'll get out and mow their lawn, and they're pretty much done. It's just a hot, humid time. Fish aren't biting. Your lenses get fogged a lot, and it's just a bad time for photographers especially. So, what's coming up? September is going to be a good month. We've got the Hawk Watch coming up. For those that don't know what that is, this is the time of year when the hawks fly down from the north up in Canada and elsewhere, and they actually fly south into Mexico, Central America, and South America for the winter. What you will find is that there are these fairly large corridors that cut down through the United States. We have one that cuts down through North Carolina. It kind of comes from the northeast and just cuts down through Virginia near Hawk Mountain. I think it's called Hawk Mountain. And comes down through our area here in the Piedmont and in the western part of North Carolina. And we actually have a place, I am actually about 10 minutes away, 5 to 10 minutes away from our Hawk Watch platform, which is Pilot Mountain State Park. And I will actually be there. If anybody wants to come out and say hi, I will actually be there probably a couple Saturdays in September. I will not be there the week of the 17th because I have to run my 5K race. But other than that, I will make an effort to be out there probably early in the morning, late in the afternoon, to see if I can see hawks. It's not particularly a great photo opportunity per se, unless you were going to use an owl decoy or something like that, which is kind of frowned upon these days. I don't really have that big of a problem with it. I'm kind of on the fence about it myself, but you still have opportunity to get shots of flocks, large flocks of various raptors. Here in North Carolina, I think we have the broad-winged hawk, the red-tailed hawk, and I think possibly sharp-shinned hawks come through here as well. And so we'll be looking for those. We'll be looking for large flocks of those. And you can sometimes get shots of them like that. You don't expect to get shots of them perched and so forth. They don't generally hang out for too long. They ride the thermals over the mountains and kind of get their breath, and then they're back heading south again. So anyway, that's coming up. Looks like a good opportunity. I'm starting a new Songbirds in Flight project in September. I'm looking forward to that, and so be looking for photographs of that coming up. But the meat of this episode, I kind of felt bad a little bit about the last episode. Or actually, it was 2 episodes ago where I really beat up the Canon 7D, and I kind of felt bad about that afterward because you can use this camera, and I wanted to take a podcast. I hadn't planned on doing this. This is not something that's on my list of ideas, but I really wanted to just go down through and explain my position on this camera. And the reason is because this camera, the Canon EOS 7D, had a long production run, and a lot of people have owned them or will own them in the future, buying on the used market. And I just wanted to explain my position on it. I wanted to explain where I'm coming from, my experiences with the camera, because I've been shooting it solid now for, a year and a half, I think, or something like that. And so I have a lot of experience with it, and I think that's valuable to you. First of all, let's go down through the specs of this camera. This camera came out in 2009, actually, so it's a fairly old camera in, I guess, digital camera years, if you will. I'm not sure how that relates to dog years, but it's something like most cameras on the used market, or most cameras have a shelf life of about 3 or 4 years now, it seems like, and they're gone. Sometimes new cameras come out every year and a half. But it ran from 2000, the production run was from 2009 to 2014. That is huge. That is a long, long run. Some of the speculation from people about that, again, it's very much speculative. Don't quote me on this. Some people thought that, Canon has struggled with their APS-C line, especially in the mid-range system, to try to make it better and better and better. And when they were trying to come out with a Canon 7D Mark II, they really tried hard to come up with something that would kind of do away with some of the bad reports from the Canon 7D. And to some degree, I think they may have succeeded in that. I'm not quite so sure. It's definitely a better camera than the 7D was. There's no getting around that. But that kind of gives some background as to maybe why it took Canon so long to come out with the 7D Mark II. The 7D has a magnesium alloy body, so it's a very rugged body. It actually feels great in the hands. I've got it sitting right here next to me. Really a nice, comfortable feel to the camera. No problems at all with ergonomics. I think it's a great design. It's very similar to the 5D Mark II, 5D Mark III. They all kind of feel relatively close to one another and have the similar size. It has an 18 megapixel APS-C sensor. It was Canon's first stab at a higher resolution sensor for the mid-range body. I mean, this is almost a 20 megapixel sensor, so it's packing a lot of pixels onto that sensor. So let's talk about that sensor real quick, and I'm going to go into more detail later. A lot of people have complained that the sensor is just a bad sensor in the Canon 7D. And although I kind of agree with that statement, and I have made statements similar to that in the past, you can get good performance out of it. I don't want to say you can get great performance, but you can get good performance using a few tips and tricks, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But for now, just realize that you can work with this sensor, okay? Especially if you're in the ISO 100, 200, 320 range. You can get some really good shots out of it. You just have to know what you're doing, okay? So a lot of the complaints that people had about the sensor, in my opinion, were probably more related to autofocus. And they were actually getting autofocus shots rather than the sensor was bad. Now, it does have higher noise. It's, like I said, in my opinion, they probably put too many megapixels on this sensor. I think it would have been better probably in the 15 megapixel range rather than 18. And I think people would have been a lot happier with it. I would have rather just seen an improved 15 megapixel sensor in this camera. But there's the whole megapixel war. Canon felt like they had to do something, so they just cram more megapixels on it. And folks, I'm here to tell you, pixel quality is a lot better than pixel quantity. This camera is a perfect example of when engineers are forced to do something they probably never wanted to do to start with. Being an engineer myself on the software side of things, I can tell you that many times I have been forced to put something into an application, software application, that I knew was going to cause serious problems. And, wanting to keep my job, of course, I put it in there. I think this sensor kind of falls into that category. Is it horrible? No. Is it great? No. So there you go. It's a mediocre sensor. Has a lot of resolution, but the pixel quality, it's okay. It's okay. It has a dual Digic 4 image processor, and that's a 14-bit processor, which is good. Step up from the 12-bit. Something you need to know about this camera is it's actually a fast camera. I cannot say enough good things about the speed of startup on this camera. The writing speed, the CF cards is great. The Digic 4 processors, having two of them in there, really was a hit. I think that was a great engineering decision. Very good design. No problems whatsoever with that. So the guys that were on the processor side of things did a great job. Congratulations to those guys. The live view is particularly good with this camera. It has I did not write it down. I think it's a 3-inch screen on the back. I'm not sure about that. Very good LCD. Very good menu system. Has an awesome menu system. Same menu system that pretty much Canon's had since this camera was introduced. Very similar to the 1D Mark IV layout. So definitely a step in the right direction. It has sensor cleaning on startup and shutdown. I never have any problems with this camera with sensor dust. That's also an awesome feature. Who wants to spend all that money on sensor cleaning swabs? That's a waste of money. So very good. It does have a 100% viewfinder. So when I look through my viewfinder, my optical viewfinder, I'm seeing 100% of the image, or thereabouts, roughly 99.9, whatever. It does have some weather sealing. I will say that I did have some problems here. Not with weather, but with sand. When I was shooting, where was I? I was at at Shackleford Banks photographing the wild horses. And this camera got some sand down behind the thumb wheel. And all of a sudden, I couldn't change any settings with the thumb wheel. Now, it cleared up as I blew the sand out of there and so forth. But that's a concern, right? As a wildlife photographer, we're often, called upon to be at the beach. A lot of wildlife lives at the beach. I mean, we've got birds, we've got crabs, snakes, bears, deer, horses. All these things can be found in or near the beach dunes. And so, we have to go there. That's part of who we are, right? And so that's a concern. I had never had that happen before. And I have taken this in the sand before also. The sand at Shackleford Banks is a very, very fine sand. It's so fine that it's just I'm not familiar with that type of sand actually. Usually you find more coarse sand, but that beach was just loaded with just very, very fine sand, kind of a white fine sand. So that's a concern. But that problem's been happening with cameras since, that's been going on for a while. I remember Moose Peterson complaining about that with the Nikon D3, I think it was, maybe, back in the day. So, that's not so much of a concern. I have never had this camera in the rain. I am not big on taking photographs during a rainstorm. I know some guys are. That's not me. So, I'd much rather be hiding under a tree until it passes over. It has a 19-point autofocus system, all cross type. The center point is a high precision, double cross type at f2.8 or faster. Now, what does that mean? We all know what cross type is. Cross type, just think of cross type as this way. Don't get into the whole XY coordinate system. Don't worry about all that. Cross type simply means it's a better autofocusing point. Because of the XY coordinate system, it takes advantage of that in a better way and gives you a faster focus. The center point is high precision, which means that point has been designed to focus the fastest of all the points on your sensor grid. So I definitely recommend using that point for attempting birds in flight or any kind of moving animal. The center point is a double cross type, and that's just crazy good, right? But you have to have a 2.8 lens on there. So most of us don't carry 2.8 lenses unless we're loaded with money. And if we're loaded with money, we probably don't have a Canon 7D body. So don't even worry about that one. But if you happen to have your Canon 50, 1.8 on there, then you could take advantage of that. It does shoot 1080p video. Does a fine job with it. I don't have a problem with it. This camera was actually used along with the 5D Mark II. It was used as a B-roll camera in one of the Marvel movies. I can't remember which one it was now, but one of the Marvel movies. So it's been to Hollywood. So it has been used professionally. It shoots roughly 8 frames per second, and you have roughly 3 seconds of raw buffer at that speed. So if I'm shooting raw, I can shoot 8 frames per second for about 3 seconds. Folks, that's plenty. I never have any problem with that. I mostly shoot in 3 to 4 shot bursts. I'm not usually just holding that thing down and hammering away. I don't really believe in that kind of photography. Certainly, I want it there in case I really need it. There's a couple of times that I have, hit the hammer down and done that, but I very, very rarely do it. So I give the camera very high marks here. 8 frames per second, awesome, love it. It also has an ISO range of 100 to 12,800 expanded. I can honestly say I would not use this camera at anything over 1600, and I would, in most cases, defer to using 400 ISO or lower. This camera has noise issues. It always has had noise issues. Those that are in the know understand this. You're going to hear people say, "Oh, it's beautiful. I don't mind the noise at all." Understand, everyone has different ideas of what is acceptable with noise. I have made great images with this camera at ISO 1600. I have not made any great images of with this camera above ISO 1600. I'm going to go into more detail on that later. Just realize that it's not a great high ISO camera. And it has to do with, I think, them putting so many megapixels into this crop sensor, excuse me. It has a max shutter speed of 1/8000. That's awesome. I never get up that high, but that's awesome. If you had a 2.8 lens, you probably could get up that high. It has a flash sync of 1/250th. Nothing spectacular there. Pretty much cameras have had that sync speed for the last 10 years, 15 years. I don't know. Even before that. So, not a big deal. It's acceptable. So we're out of the specs now. Let's talk about how to make this camera work. I want to examine a few of the problems that people have complained about over the years and what are some sensible solutions. The first is the great autofocus debacle. Okay? Is it true, or is it just bad photographers? If you go out on the internet, you're going to find, I almost always don't recommend this because it just makes you mad. You're going to find one camp that says this is a great camera, it's just the user doesn't know what he's doing, blah, blah, blah. The other camp's going to say, no, there's definitely an autofocus problem with this camera, I can prove it, and here it is. I have seen this proven online, by the way. My personal take is this. 1, yes, there is an autofocus problem with some models of this camera. 2, there were cameras made that had no autofocus problems. And 3, there are trolls online that will say just about anything to get a click. So, my particular camera model fell on the side of the has autofocus problems. Now, what does that mean, right? Because autofocus is a serious subsystem of this camera. To say it has autofocus problems, well, what kind? What does that mean? There are several types of autofocus problems that have been reported. One is the autofocus loses acquisition. So in other words, if I'm following a bird in flight and I lock onto him, as the bird travels, focus is lost. I'll tell you what, that is, I think, a legitimate concern. I have noticed some of this myself, but it's probably not my biggest concern. That is definitely a concern. I don't personally consider this camera a good birds in flight camera. Others may disagree with me. That's fine. They have maybe their copy is good. This particular one and many others are not. I don't know if it was between certain years that these bad cameras came to be, whether it was early models or late models or in between. Some people have said, again, we're on the internet, some people have said that the later cameras that were made, 2011 or whatever it was, 2014, they're better. I don't know. They definitely seem to have some kind of QC problems with these cameras, and that is just sad, I think, because Canon really wanted this camera to be a camera for the wildlife photographer, the sports photographer, enthusiast, even professionals. This is an option. Well, it was an option. I don't think it is any longer, but it was an option for professionals that were looking for a crop sensor camera in very specific situations. So it was targeted to those two audiences. There were even some wedding photographers out there shooting with this camera. So I know there were some good copies. I know that. Okay. I also know that Canon couldn't fix the problems if you sent it back to them. There are many legitimate sources on the internet, not just people shooting their mouths off in forums and so forth, but legitimate sources where people sent this back to Canon and they just couldn't fix it. No matter what they did, they couldn't fix it. And so I am going to say it has autofocus problems. The second thing that people complain about is the autofocus gets worse after each use of the camera. So in other words, I turn my switch to the on position as I'm photographing my birds or whatever. And then I get home and I turn the camera off, or I'm on my way from the location. I turn my camera off. I let the camera sit for a few days. I go back out. I turn it on. The autofocus gets a little worse. And this pattern repeats each time I cycle the power on the camera on and off, and I shoot with it over time. Literally, the focus gets worse and worse and worse and worse. This is primarily what I am seeing. This is the problem that I have had with this camera in the past, and what I still have with the camera. It's a weird thing. Being a computer programmer, I can tell you that it's probably a bug somewhere in the autofocus subsystem. Probably, most likely, a bug in the firmware, but not necessarily, because if it was a firmware issue, you would see it across the board most likely. So I'm leaning more toward a hardware problem somewhere in there. I shouldn't have said most likely, because it really isn't. I'm leaning more toward a hardware problem. So I'm going to explain how to handle these problems in a minute, but let's just keep going. Third problem that people were reporting was the autofocus system focuses on an area not specified by the currently chosen autofocus point. So in other words, I'm at the zoo and I have single point autofocus selected. I focus on the animal's eye, but instead it focuses on the grass in front of the animal. Okay, that's a whole nother scenario. Yes, this camera was known to have front focusing and somewhat back focusing issues. I'll get into that in a minute. Let's move on. The fourth problem that it had, reportedly, or reported by some people, random back focusing and front focusing issues. Now, when I mean random, I mean a front focusing issue that couldn't be corrected by using the micro adjust feature. In other words, one time you go out and shoot, it was front focusing, the next time it was right on the money, the next time it was back focusing. That's hard to define that kind of situation, right? It could be a user error. So, that's again, that's one of those things that I'm not completely 100% sure about. I think it's probably more related to the second reason, which is the autofocus gets worse after each use. I think number 2 is probably the greatest problem with this camera. Now let's move on, and I'm going to explain how you can get past this and actually use this camera if you still have it. The first thing that you're going to want to do with the autofocus system on this camera is go out to Art Morris's website or somebody like that and find out what settings that they're using. I'm not going to list all that here. It's long, it's boring. There's lots of YouTube videos on it. Go ahead and just Google autofocus settings 7D birds in flight. Okay, and you'll get a lot of various results all showing you how to set your camera up. That's not the issue at hand here. It's not the different modes. I've heard that argument a billion times, and I'm telling you that's not the problem. Okay, so what I recommend that people do with autofocus, just in general, is when you're shooting a moving subject, particularly birds, elk, any kind of deer, horses, whatever, is use autofocus AF point expansion. It's the center point and 4 around it. What does this do for you? So if I am on a subject and that subject just erratically changes direction and I try to track and follow him, chances are my center point is not going to stay on that bird's breast or his eye. But the other surrounding points, the 4 points surrounding it, will pick that up and continue autofocusing. So that seems to give me the best chance at making this work from a birds in flight perspective. Again, I don't recommend this for birds in flight, but if you absolutely must, then by all means use AF point expansion. The other thing that is recommended is that you use one-shot AF for static subjects. So if you know for a fact, which we often don't know, if you know for a fact that you are going into a situation where every animal is going to be static and not running, then use one-shot AF. It's supposed to be a little more accurate with the 7D. I don't know if that's true. I have not been able to test this. This is just something that is suggested out there by people in the know. Personally, I don't think it's probably going to matter a whole lot, but it's something to try. Here, this next item, the third item here on how to handle autofocus issues, is probably the craziest thing I have ever seen that actually works. Before I use my 7D, I will do this process, what I'm about to tell you, and it solves the whole problem of the autofocus getting worse after each use of the camera. Okay, here it goes. You take your 7D. I've got it right here, so I'm going to walk through it so that I don't miss any steps. You open the battery compartment, remove the main battery. Inside of that chamber where the battery goes is your CMOS battery, or your date time battery, it's often called. It's a CR1616 3-volt battery. It's just barely in there. It's just this little tiny battery. Pull that out. Set it down on the table. Turn your camera to the on position. Go ahead and hold down the shutter button, move some dials around, make sure that thing, let it sit for about a half an hour. Make sure that thing is totally drained of battery. Okay? After that, reverse the process. Turn your camera off. Put the CMOS battery in, the little CR battery. Put that in. Put your main battery in. Turn it on, and go shoot. That's what I have to do every time I shoot this camera. Or I will have autofocus that gets worse every time I use the camera. Yeah. Now you know why I'm not a fan of this camera. Because every time I do that, I have to go back in and set the date time again. Mm-hmm. You don't lose any of your settings. That's the cool thing. So all your C1, C2 custom settings, all that stays in there. All your Q menu stuff, it stays the same. Your custom menus that you've created stays the same. Fabulous. That is a workaround that works 99.9% of the time. I have kind of seen it not work, but not really. It generally works. Canon, why did you do this? With a camera that ran so many years through production, why did they not address this issue? I think I know why. They did not address the issue because they knew they couldn't fix it without tearing the camera half to pieces. They knew they couldn't fix it. Maybe it was an issue where they couldn't fix it because there was too much labor involved. Maybe they couldn't fix it because there really was no fix to it. Maybe it was so ingrained in the hardware, or maybe simply they just were in denial about this, which is also very highly possible. Without a doubt, this camera, if you got a bad model on the used market, or even new, you were dead, basically. So, okay, that's how to handle the autofocus. Now, the other thing that you can do with autofocus that I think is helpful is to calibrate your lens to the camera body itself. Oftentimes, the lenses, even Canon lenses, but mostly third party, but even Canon lenses will need to be micro adjusted. And I'm not going to go into this process. Simply type in micro adjust Canon 7D, and you'll have a bazillion videos on YouTube to watch. Basically, how the process works is you have this target that you set up. You can make your own, actually, but they do sell more sophisticated ones, which you may want to purchase online. You basically set your camera up, across the room from this target, and it's a high contrast target, like you see when they're doing lens testing and so forth. And then you'll have something that looks like a ruler next to it, and you can actually use a yardstick if you want to with this. And what you will do is you'll focus on the big target, and then you'll zoom in. After you take the photograph, you'll zoom into that, and you'll be able to zoom into that ruler and see if you're front focusing or back focusing or right on the mark. And you can micro adjust your lenses. Like, for example, my 150 to 600 has a -2 adjustment with a 7D. So that's another way to help this camera focus better. Again, it's not going to solve your birds in flight problem. I'm sorry. It's not going to solve dropped autofocusing and so forth. That's just a problem with the camera itself. And I'm not saying you can't get a good shot here and a good shot there with it. You can. You absolutely can. But I'm not in this to get a 20%, 10 to 20% success ratio. I'm in this to get 40, 50, 60, 70% of my images in focus. When I look at my 1D Mark II, for example, which is a much older camera than this one, I see a completely different autofocus system. I see a better autofocusing system. I see an autofocusing system that locks on and stays locked on. So I know what I'm talking about here. I came from the 1 series to this body, and this body just doesn't cut it in any way, shape, or form with birds in flight. You can go out to my website. You can see birds in flight shots I've shot with this camera. Go to my Flickr account. You'll see them. But there is a very low percentage. I photographed many, many, many birds that day. And we're not talking, fast flying birds here either. We're talking, spoonbills and herons and things like that, which are not incredibly fast birds. The camera should have no problem locking on and photographing them. This camera has a serious problem with that. Okay, the last problem that we got to solve with this camera is the high noise problem, or the unacceptable noise issues, I should say. Like I said, the first thing is make sure you're below 1600 ISO in most cases. I will push this to 1600 ISO if I have to, but trust me, I would not do it. The second thing you can do is you can use ETTR, which simply means exposing to the right on your histogram. Essentially, what this is, I'll just get into a brief explanation of it. Essentially, especially with these cameras that have high noise, you need to overexpose the scene to some degree in order to reduce the noise. You're adding more information into the histogram. You are or into the file. You are basically taking it as far to the right as you can without clipping the highlights. So you don't want overexposed highlights, or blinkies, they're called. So if you look at the back of your display and you see it blinking, you're hitting the edge. You're on that. You're in a situation where the whites are so bright that they no longer have any information. So we don't want to go that far. We want to go just to that and then back a little bit. And that does help with this camera. You do have a lot better performance noise-wise. So I do recommend doing that. But, you know, it's not going to solve all your problems. It's still going to be a fairly noisy camera. Situations where you have kind of a muddy background, which we often do in wildlife photography. Oftentimes we have a dark background. We might be shooting an elk out in a field, and behind him is a shadowy forest. Well, in the 7D, that shadowy forest is going to be very noisy. And it does have some color noise. So that's something to be also think about. I'm surprised it actually has so much color noise, to be honest with you. And finally, as a last ditch, you know, I gotta fix this thing. It looks terrible. You can bring it into Photoshop, and you can use masking tools to blur out the background in a post-processing way. You know, so I do this sometimes. Actually, I don't like to do it, but I will do it if I have to. Essentially, you are masking the image, and you're blurring everything in that image except the subject. Not heavily, just enough to get rid of the noise. And I'll do that. Now, what it's not going to do is it's not going to get rid of that clumpiness. A lot of times when you're using a higher ISO, you get this, and you know what I'm talking about. You've seen it in your pictures. The background has almost this clumpiness to it. And that's just a side effect of the noise and the lower performance of the sensor at that ISO. So that's pretty much it. I mean, that's how to deal with the 7D if you absolutely have to. And I'm in that same boat as you if you happen to be there. I am going to have this camera probably for another year to year and a half, and I'll probably still use it for a family video camera. Even after that, I may sell it, but I almost have some morality entering the picture here. Do I really want to sell this thing to someone else, knowing that it's not the best autofocusing camera? I don't know. All right, so let's move on. One more positive note. This camera can be used effectively in other scenarios. You don't have to, as an all-around camera, it's pretty decent. As a wildlife camera, I give it failing marks in general. But now I still use it. Like I used it in my hummingbird pictures I took a couple months ago. I will use it in my songbirds in flight project coming up. I got no problem with that. I'm not autofocusing on anything. I'm using manual focus for this shoot. I don't need to worry about it. Anything that you're using manual focus, anything that you can have a little more control over, you can zoom in on the subject and look for focus issues, it'll work fine for. Generally speaking, it works fine for static subjects. It works fine for larger animals that are moving very slowly, horses, grazing, things like that. Generally, no problems. But if you're picky like I am, and you want that thing to work every time, you might be a little disappointed with this camera. That's all I'm saying. And I really want to emphasize this because there are so many of these on the used market right now that a lot of people are picking them up because they're such good deals. I mean, I think you can get them now for about $400 for a bargain price, $400 online. That's cheap, really. Considering this was a $1,000 plus camera when it came out. I forget what the original price was on this. I think it was about $1,200 or $1,300 maybe, or $1,400. I can't remember. Certainly wasn't worth $1,400, but that's what it was when it came out. Honestly, if I were you and you're looking for a bargain right now, I would not buy this camera. I would probably go with maybe a 1D Mark III, even though it's only 10 megapixels long in the tooth. If you're really on a budget, you got nothing, your Kraft macaroni and cheese broke, I would go with a Canon 1D Mark II or 1D Mark II-N. If you have a little bit of budget but not enough to buy, a 1DX or 1DX2, I would go with a 1D Mark IV right now. It's a heck of a bargain at about $1,100. But I just wanted to do this podcast because I felt like I needed to kind of justify my little rant that I went on a couple episodes ago as to why and what's led up to some of the issues with this camera. And this podcast, if you're just joining this podcast for any reason, you have to understand where I'm coming from. This podcast has a very niche audience. Okay, this podcast was designed from the beginning to be about my experiences, how I can relate those to you. It was designed for people who are budget-minded, that are looking for gear that doesn't break the bank but still takes great photographs. And so we look at cameras like this. We look at the 7D. We look at these cameras that are older but maybe a good bargain. I am not and never will be probably an explorer of light or a gear hound, that's buying the latest 1D Mark 150. It's just not going to be who I am in this podcast. And that may turn some of you off. I hope it doesn't, because I also have a lot of other things about this podcast. I don't want gear to be an emphasis in this podcast, and so I'm reluctant to even do episodes like this. And the one I did 2 episodes ago, I'm reluctant to do that because I really want this to be more about taking great photographs, not spending money on a lot of gear. So, but again, I hope that helped you, and I hope that you don't have any too hard feelings going on there. Again, this is largely subjective. This is my experiences. It may not be your experiences, and hopefully I can help some of you out there. That's always my goal with this. I mean, I don't do this just to hear myself talk. I'm doing this to try to help others that may be in the same situation. Okay, let's move on to know your subject. I felt that we should probably do a hawk this episode because of the great hawk migration going on in this month. And I chose the red-shouldered hawk. I may have actually done a previous episode on this bird. I don't have a lot of experience photographing the red-shouldered hawk. Most of my images that I do have, most of them were taken in captivity. I do have a couple that I've shot that I'm not really that proud of in the wild. But you can get lucky and you can photograph these guys. They're heavily populated in the south in the United States. I see them all the time. I just photographed a red-shouldered hawk's nest about 4 months ago when I was out walking some trails. So they're out there and they're around, but they're not easy to photograph. They're kind of skittish, if you will. So according to Cornell's Lab of Ornithology, the red-shouldered hawk is a medium-sized hawk with broad, rounded wings and a medium-length tail that when it's fanned out and when that fans out when it's soaring. In flight, they often glide or soar with their wingtips pushed slightly forward, imparting a distinctive reaching posture. Adults are colorful hawks with dark and white checkered wings, warm reddish barring on the breast. The tail is black with narrow white bands. Immatures are brown above and white below, streaked with brown. All ages show narrow, pale crescents near the wingtips in flight. The red-shouldered hawks soar above forests or perch on tree branches or utility wires. It has a whistle, a distinctive sound. They hunt small mammals, amphibians, and reptiles from perches or while flying. That's interesting. You can look for the red-shouldered hawks in deciduous woodlands, often near rivers and swamps. They build stick nests in a main crotch of a large tree. During migration, red-shouldered hawks often move high overhead along ridges or along the coast. Okay, so that's the scientific part of the whole thing. How do I photograph them? I wished I knew. No, actually, I do know a little bit about this. I have found them in parks, nature preserves, driving down the road. The nest that I recently photographed mainly just for documentary purposes was exactly the way they described it here. It was up in a pine tree. It was near a river. It was kind of in the crook of a tree branch, like where a fork, where the tree comes together in a fork. That's where the nest was. I have seen them soaring near my house here, although I can never get glass on them for some reason. And I of course shoot portraits of them in captivity, and that's a good place to start. If you're just getting into this game, by all means, please go to your local rehab centers, go to zoos, get used to your camera, photograph portraits of these animals. Once you can make good portraits, then you can move on to doing more serious wildlife work in the field. I definitely suggest everyone, and even seasoned professionals, okay, or semi-pros, I still recommend taking a trip to the zoo once a year and just working out the kinks, man. Making sure your camera works good, kind of a check ride. Make sure your camera works good, make sure the focus is on, make sure you got it micro adjusted, make sure that there's not any severe issues with your lens. Make sure that the optics are aligning properly, all that stuff. Go ahead and get out there and do it. Don't wait till you get to a great location and find out that, oh, my camera's not working right, or my lens is way, way off. It's not autofocusing right, or, don't wait till then to find that out. Go to your zoo. That's one of the reasons they're there, so we can, view an animal up close. Get out there, no pressure. It's kind of a no-brainer, really. Okay, so that's the red-shouldered hawk. I wanted to talk about something today which I really hesitated to talk about. I don't know if this is too early in the process. I don't want to turn anybody off. That's the last thing I want to do. I don't want this to be about making money and all that kind of stuff. This is not what this podcast is for. I make my money as a software developer. I sell my photographs on the side. I'm a semi-pro. This is not about making money. But I did set up a Patreon site for this podcast, and I'll put the link in the show notes. And I've just got a couple of levels of support that are people can do out there. One is $1 a month, big deal, right? $1 a month, anybody can probably swing that. The other one is a $3 a month commitment, and basically, I would use that money to try to buy better equipment for the podcast, a better microphone, for example. This microphone is just inexpensive, kind of I wouldn't say it's a nice microphone. It's an advanced chat microphone. So it's one of the higher end chat microphones, but it's not a good microphone for podcasting. And so that's something I need to purchase. Paying for hosting services. Maybe even if we get enough, maybe even I can do some reviews on some other used gear options for you. I wouldn't be opposed to doing that. That's perfectly fine. But that's the kind of thing that money would go toward. I wouldn't be putting it into my personal bank account to use for bread and milk and stuff like that. It would strictly go to this podcast and other things like the website, keeping up my, but primarily the podcast. The money would go there first, and I think that's where it needs to go. So if that's something you feel like you can do, go for it. If it's not, if you don't have the money, your Kraft macaroni and cheese broke, I totally get it. I've been there. So don't feel bad about that. This is not a plea for an angry plea or anything like that. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there. Please go out there and subscribe to the podcast. That helps get our numbers up so that we become more popular. And when I say we, I mean you and I become more popular. This is not a one-man band here. You guys are part of this. You listen to it. And I feel like that's when I say we, that's what I mean. Yes, it is about my photography, but it's hopefully so much more than that. So let's see, what else do we got going on? Don't forget to get out there and go to Hawkwatch. Like I said, I'll be here in North Carolina. If anybody's listening from North Carolina, I'd love to meet you out there at Pilot Mountain State Park and just chat with you about photography or whatever. But anyway, thanks for listening. Make it a great day and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.